The cabin looked like a grass-covered hill that had sprouted a door and a chimney. Most settlers riding past would shake their heads, some would laugh outright, and a few would mutter prayers for the poor fool who'd built it. It sat on the Nebraska prairie in 1874, 23 miles southwest of the new town of Grand Island. While every other homesteader in the territory was frantically sawing lumber and hammering together wooden frame houses, this structure appeared to be made of nothing but dirt, grass, and desperation. His name was Hermann Weber, a German immigrant who'd arrived in New York Harbor in 1871 with $42 in his pocket, a trunk full of books, and ideas that would make him the laughingstock of Hall County. He was 36 years old, had trained as a stonemason in Bavaria, and had spent 2 years working on buildings in Chicago before the call of free land pulled him west. The Homestead Act promised 160 acres to anyone willing to prove up a claim. Herman filed his papers in June of 1874 and immediately began building the strangest structure anyone in Nebraska had seen. They called it the mud hut. They called it the sod monstrosity. Some called Herman the dirt hermit, or the crazy German who thought he could live in a hole. The criticism started the moment he began digging. While other settlers were marking out foundations and felling trees, Herman was excavating. He dug into the side of a gentle slope, creating a space 16 feet wide, 24 feet deep, and 8 feet high at the front. To the neighbors watching, it looked like he was digging his own grave. Jacob Morrison, whose claim bordered Herman's to the north, rode over in early July to see what was happening. Morrison was 42, had come from Ohio, and considered himself an experienced frontiersman despite having arrived in Nebraska only 6 months earlier. He sat on his horse watching Herman shovel dirt onto a growing pile. "What exactly are you building?" Morrison asked. "A house," Herman replied, not stopping his work. "Looks like you're digging a root cellar." "It will be both." Morrison laughed. "You planning to live underground like a badger?" "The earth is the best insulation God created. In Germany, we understood this. Here, everyone ignores it." Morrison shook his head. "Good luck spending winter in a dirt hole. I'll be in my proper frame house with proper walls and a proper roof." He rode away, already composing the story he'd tell the other settlers about the German who was digging a burrow. The mockery spread quickly. Nebraska in 1874 was filling with settlers at an unprecedented rate. The railroad had pushed through, making the journey from the east faster and cheaper. Towns were springing up every few miles, and with all these people came competition, comparison, and judgment. Everyone was watching everyone else, measuring their progress, their ambition, their fitness for frontier life. Herman's approach violated every expectation. A proper homestead cabin should be visible, should announce its presence, should demonstrate that civilization was taming the wild prairie. Herman's structure was doing the opposite. It was burrowing into the earth, hiding, retreating. It looked cowardly. It looked poor. It looked like the work of a man who didn't believe in his own future. But Herman wasn't building for appearances. He was building for physics. The construction technique Herman employed was ancient, far older than the wood frame houses his neighbors were throwing together. He was creating what Europeans called an earth-sheltered dwelling, and what would later be known in America as a dugout or hillside home. But Herman's version was more sophisticated than the desperate shelters most pioneers dug when they first arrived. He was applying principles he'd learned in Bavaria, where stone and earth construction had been refined over centuries. The excavation itself was strategic. Herman had chosen the south-facing slope deliberately. This orientation would allow winter sun to reach the front of the structure, while the earth itself provided protection from the north winds. He dug back into the hill at a slight upward angle, ensuring water would drain away from the interior rather than pooling inside. The floor of the excavation was covered with a layer of large stones, creating drainage and preventing ground moisture from wicking up into the living space. The walls were where Herman's real innovation began. He didn't just dig a hole and call it done. He reinforced the excavated earth walls with a technique he'd adapted from European building methods. He cut sod bricks, thick rectangular chunks of prairie soil held together by the dense root systems of buffalo grass and other native plants. Each brick measured roughly 12 inches wide, 24 inches long, and 4 inches thick. The weight was substantial, approximately 40 pounds per brick. He cut these bricks from his own land, selecting areas where the grass roots were thickest and most intertwined. But unlike other settlers who were building traditional sod houses by stacking these bricks like masonry, Herman used them as a facing over the excavated earth walls. He dug small horizontal shelves into the earth walls every 2 feet and laid the sod bricks on these shelves, grass side in. This created a stable, self-supporting wall that was backed by the mass of the earth itself. The result was a wall that was effectively 4 feet thick, 2 feet of earth, then 4 inches of sod brick, then an air gap of about 4 inches, then another 4 inches of sod brick on the interior. This created a sandwich of earth, air, and organic material that would prove to have remarkable insulating properties. The ceiling was the most complex part of the structure. Herman had purchased 30 rough-cut cottonwood logs from a mill 40 miles away, one of his few concessions to conventional materials. These logs, each about 8 inches in diameter and 20 feet long, became the ceiling joists. He laid them across the width of the structure, spacing them 16 inches apart. The ends of these logs extended 3 feet beyond the front of the excavation and were supported by 4 heavy posts made from the same cottonwood. On top of these joists, Herman laid a floor of split cottonwood planks. This created the base for his roof. But he didn't stop there. On top of the planks, he spread a layer of prairie hay, 8 inches thick. On top of the hay, he laid a waterproof membrane made from sheets of overlapped birch bark that he'd harvested and prepared himself. On top of the bark, he placed another layer of hay, this one 12 inches thick. And finally, on top of everything, he laid sod bricks, grass side up, covering the entire roof surface. The final roof was 18 inches thick and weighed several tons. The cottonwood logs creaked under the load, but they held. Herman had calculated the weight and the strength of the wood. He knew it would support the mass. What he created was a living roof, a thick blanket of earth and grass that would continue growing, with roots binding everything together, creating an increasingly solid and waterproof surface. The front wall, the only part of the structure not backed by earth, received special treatment. Herman built a double wall using sod bricks. The outer wall was 2 bricks thick, 8 inches total. Then a 6-inch air gap filled with loose prairie hay. Then an inner wall, also 2 bricks thick. The total thickness of the front wall was 22 inches. He left openings for a door and the 2 small windows. The door was heavy wood, built from planks and fitted with unusual care. The windows were actual glass, 4 panes each, purchased at considerable expense from Grand Island. Inside, Herman built a stone fireplace and chimney. He'd hauled river stones for weeks to gather enough material. The fireplace was positioned not against a wall, but extending into the room from the north side, creating a stone mass that would absorb and radiate heat. The chimney rose through the thick roof, and Herman had carefully waterproofed where it penetrated the layers of hay, bark, and sod. The floor was packed earth covered with flat stones laid in sand, creating a stable, solid surface that could be swept clean. By late September, the structure was complete. Herman had spent 4 months on construction. His neighbors had watched the process with a mixture of amusement and pity. They'd built their own houses in 4 to 6 weeks. They had proper wooden walls, proper shingled roofs, proper glass windows facing in all directions. They looked like houses. Herman's structure looked like a grass-covered mound with a door. The comments grew more pointed as autumn arrived. Sarah Morrison, Jacob's wife, made her opinion clear to anyone who'd listen. "That German man has built himself a tomb. Mark my words, he'll suffocate in there, or the roof will cave in and bury him. It's not natural, living in the dirt like an animal." Her husband agreed. Man wasn't meant to burrow. We're supposed to stand above the earth, not hide beneath it. That's what separates us from the beasts. Other neighbors echoed these sentiments. The structure violated something fundamental in their understanding of civilization and progress. The frontier was supposed to be about building up, not digging down. It was supposed to be about conquering nature, not surrendering to it. Herman's earth-covered dwelling felt like a step backward, a retreat into primitiveness. Some suspected he was simply too poor to build a real house. Others thought he was lazy, taking the easy way out. A few considered him mentally unbalanced, pursuing bizarre foreign ideas that had no place on the American prairie. Herman heard all of it. He was a quiet man, not given to arguing or defending himself. He simply continued his work, preparing for winter. He cut and stacked firewood, though noticeably less than his neighbors were accumulating. He filled his root cellar, which was simply an extension of his main room, dug deeper into the hillside with vegetables and preserved foods. He seemed unconcerned with the opinions swirling around him. If you are enjoying this story of frontier innovation and forgotten building wisdom, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We uncover the lost knowledge of America's past, the techniques and insights that allowed our ancestors to thrive in harsh conditions with limited resources. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you do not miss future episodes. October of 1874 brought the first test. A cold snap hit Nebraska, unusually early and unusually severe. Nighttime temperatures dropped into the low 20s Fahrenheit. During the day, temperatures struggled to reach 40 degrees. A sharp north wind blew steadily, making the cold feel even more brutal. This was when the differences between Herman's structure and the conventional cabins began to reveal themselves. Jacob Morrison's frame house, built with 2x4 studs and 1-inch board siding, had no insulation beyond the air trapped within the wall cavity. The gaps between boards had been covered with tar paper, but the wind still found ways through. The single-pane windows leaked cold air around the frames. The wooden floor, elevated on posts above the ground, allowed cold air to circulate beneath. Morrison had installed a wood stove in the center of the main room, and he kept it burning hot. The stove radiated intense heat, making the area immediately around it almost too warm, but 10 feet away, the temperature dropped noticeably. In the corners of the room, frost formed on the interior walls during the coldest nights. Morrison burned through firewood at an alarming rate. He'd estimated he'd need 4 cords to get through winter. By mid-October, after just 2 weeks of cold weather, he realized his estimate was wildly inadequate. He was burning nearly half a cord per week. At this rate, he'd need 12 to 15 cords to make it through to spring. He spent his days cutting and hauling more wood, a constant, exhausting battle to stay ahead of the cold. Other neighbors faced similar struggles. The frame houses, built quickly and cheaply, were proving to be thermal sieves. Heat escaped through every gap, every poorly fitted window, every thin wall. The settlers had built for appearance and speed. Now they were paying the price in comfort and labor. Herman's experience was dramatically different. He'd lit a small fire in his stone fireplace on the evening the cold snap began. The fire was modest, using perhaps a quarter of the wood Morrison was burning. And then something remarkable happened. The structure held the heat. The thick earth walls, with their massive thermal mass, absorbed the warmth from the fire. The 18-inch thick roof, insulated with layers of hay and sod, prevented heat from escaping upward. The front wall, with its 22 inches of sod and trapped air, blocked the cold wind. The result was a space that warmed slowly, but stayed warm. By the second day of the cold snap, Herman noticed he barely needed to maintain the fire. The stone fireplace mass had heated up and was radiating warmth steadily. The earth walls themselves had become warm to the touch. The interior temperature stabilized at around 62 degrees Fahrenheit, even when outside temperatures were in the 20s. The heat his small fire produced wasn't escaping. It was being stored in the structure itself, in the thousands of pounds of earth and stone that surrounded him. And there was another benefit Herman hadn't fully anticipated. The air quality was remarkable. Unlike the frame houses, where wood stoves consumed oxygen and produced smoke that sometimes backdrafted into the living space, Herman's structure seemed to breathe naturally. The earth walls allowed a slow, steady exchange of air, enough to keep the atmosphere fresh, but not enough to create drafts or lose significant heat. The humidity level stayed comfortable. There was no condensation on the walls, no feeling of dampness that plagued many pioneer dwellings. Herman began taking temperature readings. He'd brought a thermometer from Chicago, a luxury many settlers didn't possess. In late October, on a morning when the outside temperature was 18 degrees Fahrenheit, with a brutal north wind, he measured the temperature inside his structure at 58 degrees. No fire had been burning for 8 hours. The residual heat stored in the earth and stone was maintaining a livable temperature. He rekindled his fire, burning wood for just 2 hours, and the interior temperature rose to 66 degrees. It would stay above 60 for the next 16 hours. He mentioned these observations to Jacob Morrison when they met at the general store in Grand Island. Morrison was skeptical. "You're saying your dirt hole stays warm without a fire? That's impossible. Heat doesn't just appear from nowhere." "The heat doesn't appear," Herman explained. "It's stored. The earth walls hold warmth the way a stone holds heat from the sun. My fire charges the walls like a battery. They release the heat slowly, over many hours." Morrison shook his head. "Sounds like German superstition to me. A house needs a good hot fire burning all day, or it's cold. That's just the way it is." But he was troubled. He was exhausted from cutting wood. His hands were raw, his back ached, and he was burning through his wood supply at an unsustainable rate. Herman, meanwhile, looked rested and comfortable. Something didn't add up. November brought the real test. A series of blizzards hammered Nebraska, starting on November 7th and continuing intermittently through the end of the month. Snow fell in massive quantities, driven by winds that created drifts 15 feet high. Temperatures plunged to 0 and below. For days at a time, settlers couldn't leave their cabins. This was the crucible that would prove or destroy every homestead in the territory. The frame houses suffered terribly. The wind found every crack and gap. Snow infiltrated through the smallest openings, accumulating in corners and along baseboards. The thin walls provided minimal protection. Settlers burned wood frantically, keeping fires roaring day and night. But the heat escaped almost as fast as it was produced. Interior temperatures in the frame houses during the blizzards rarely exceeded 45 degrees, even with fires burning constantly. Sleep was miserable, huddled under every blanket and piece of clothing the family owned. Water froze in buckets placed just feet from the stove. Frost coated the interior walls. The wind created a constant whistling and rattling, a nerve-wracking reminder of how thin and fragile the walls were. Families worried the roofs would blow off or the walls would collapse under the force of the wind. Several cabins did suffer damage. Roofs lifted and twisted, windows shattered, walls racked and separated. The psychological toll was immense. The cold was inescapable, present in every moment, draining energy and hope. Settlers began to wonder if they'd made a terrible mistake coming to Nebraska. The promised land of opportunity was revealing itself as a frozen hell. Herman's experience during the November blizzards was so different it seemed impossible to his neighbors. When the first blizzard hit, on November 7th, Herman was prepared. He'd stocked his root cellar with food, had firewood stored inside his structure, and had secured everything that could blow away. Then he closed his heavy door, shuttered his windows, and settled in to wait out the storm. The wind howled outside, but inside the sound was muted, a distant roar rather than an immediate threat. The thick earth walls dampened the noise. More importantly, they blocked the wind completely. There were no drafts, no cold air infiltration, no whistling through gaps. The structure was sealed, solid, immovable. Herman lit his fire and kept it burning at a moderate level, not the roaring blaze that frame houses required. The interior temperature stayed steady at 64 degrees. As the blizzard continued for 3 days, Herman made a remarkable discovery. The outside temperature had dropped to 10 degrees below zero. The wind chill was calculated later to be near 40 below. Yet inside his earth-sheltered structure, the temperature never fell below 60 degrees. Even when he let his fire die down to coals overnight, the residual heat in the earth walls and stone fireplace maintained a comfortable temperature. He calculated the difference. Outside, negative 10 degrees. Inside, positive 60 degrees, a 70-degree difference. And during the worst of the blizzard, when outside temperatures hit negative 15, his interior stayed at 62 degrees, 77 degrees warmer. But the most dramatic measurement came on November 23rd. A particularly brutal cold snap pushed outside temperatures to negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was screaming at 40 miles per hour, creating a wind chill that would freeze exposed skin in minutes. Frame houses across the territory were losing the battle against this cold. Even with fires burning continuously, interior temperatures were dropping. Some families were seeing inside temperatures in the low 30s, despite their best efforts. Herman took his thermometer reading that morning. Inside his structure, with no fire burning for 12 hours, the temperature was 56 degrees. He built up his fire, burning wood, for 3 hours, and the interior temperature rose to 65 degrees. Outside, negative 22 degrees. Inside, 65 degrees. A difference of 87 degrees Fahrenheit. Later that evening, as outside temperatures dropped even further to negative 25, his interior temperature was still 63 degrees, 88 degrees warmer than the outside. But the measurement that would become legendary happened the next morning. November 24th dawned as the coldest day of the early winter. Outside temperature, negative 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind chill, calculated at negative 60 degrees. Deadly lethal cold that would kill an exposed person in minutes. Herman's interior temperature, measured at dawn before he'd rebuilt his fire, 61 degrees Fahrenheit. The difference, 89 degrees. But it was the comparison with Jacob Morrison's frame house that would shock the community. Morrison, desperate and exhausted from fighting the cold, had mentioned to another settler that his house had dropped to 18 degrees inside that same morning, despite burning wood all night. When this number reached Herman, he did the calculation. His structure, 61 degrees. Morrison's structure, 18 degrees. A difference of 43 degrees between the two houses, both occupied, both heated, both fighting the same brutal cold. And later accounts would refine this to an even more dramatic comparison. At the peak of the cold snap, Herman's structure was documented at maintaining 65 degrees, while frame houses in the area were struggling to stay above 18 degrees, a difference of 47 degrees Fahrenheit. Word of these temperature differences spread through the community, carried by settlers who were suffering in their cold cabins and couldn't understand how the crazy German in his dirt hole was comfortable. The mockery began to die. It was replaced by curiosity, then grudging respect, then outright envy. December brought a delegation to Herman's door. 5 neighboring homesteaders, including Jacob Morrison, asked if they could see the inside of his structure. Herman welcomed them in. They stepped through his heavy door, and the difference was immediate and shocking. Outside it was 8 degrees with a cutting wind. Inside, It was 63 degrees and perfectly still. No drafts, no cold spots, just steady, comfortable warmth. The men stood in silence looking around. The stone fireplace with its glowing coals, the earth walls, smooth and dry, the packed earth and stone floor, solid and clean. The space was dimly lit from the two small windows, but it was warm, genuinely warm. Warmer than any of their houses had been in weeks. Jacob Morrison put his hand on the interior earth wall. It was warm to the touch, radiating stored heat. He looked at Herman with something approaching awe. "How is this possible? You're barely burning any wood." "Your fire is tiny, but it's warmer in here than in my house with the stove blazing." Herman explained the principles he'd applied. The earth itself, he told them, maintains a relatively constant temperature year-round once you're deep enough. In this region, about 6 to 8 feet below the surface, the earth stays around 50 to 55 degrees regardless of outside conditions. His structure was essentially embedded in this stable temperature zone. The thick walls didn't just insulate, they also acted as thermal mass. They absorbed heat from his fire slowly, stored it in the millions of pounds of earth surrounding the space, and released it back gradually over many hours. The thick roof prevented heat from escaping upward. The front wall, though exposed to the outside air, was thick enough to resist heat transfer, and the whole structure worked as a system, a sealed thermal envelope that trapped heat and prevented cold infiltration. "But doesn't the earth itself get cold?" Nies, one of the settlers, asked. "Eventually, wouldn't the cold soak through?" Herman shook his head. "Earth is a poor conductor of heat, which means it's a good insulator. The cold moves through earth very slowly. The earth touching my walls is warmed by my fire. That warmth spreads slowly into the surrounding earth. But the rate of heat loss is far slower than in a thin wooden wall, and I'm constantly adding small amounts of heat from my fire, maintaining the temperature of the earth around my living space." He showed them his firewood supply. In 2 months of cold weather, he'd burned through less than 2 cords of wood. Morrison had already burned through 8 cords and was cutting more daily. The efficiency was undeniable. Another settler asked about dampness. Wasn't living in earth inherently damp? Herman explained that the structure breathed naturally through the earth walls, allowing moisture to escape while retaining heat. The roof layers, with their birch bark moisture barrier, prevented rain and melting snow from penetrating. The floor, built on a stone drainage layer, prevented ground moisture from wicking up. The interior was actually drier than many frame houses, which often suffered from condensation when warm interior air hit cold windows and walls. The men left Herman's structure that day with a new understanding. The dirt hole they'd mocked was actually a sophisticated piece of thermal engineering. It worked with nature rather than against it. It used the Earth's stable temperature as an asset rather than fighting to impose human will on an indifferent environment. Several of the men asked if Herman would help them build similar structures. He agreed. The winter of 1874 to 1875 became a turning point in Hall County homestead construction. As the brutal cold continued through January and February, more settlers came to examine Herman's dwelling. Some made modifications to their existing structures, adding earth berms against north walls or extra insulation to roofs. Others, planning for the next building season, began to reconsider their approach entirely. Herman's wood consumption for the entire winter, November through March, totaled 7 cords. Jacob Morrison burned through 23 cords, more than 3 times as much. The labor difference was immense. Morrison spent roughly 3 days per week cutting and hauling wood. Herman spent less than a day per week. The energy and time Morrison lost to fuel gathering was energy, and time he couldn't spend on other tasks, building fences, breaking sod, improving his land, or simply resting. The efficiency of Herman's structure gave him a quality of life advantage that extended far beyond simple comfort. There was another benefit that became apparent as winter wore on. Herman's health remained good. He didn't suffer from the respiratory problems that plagued many settlers, the constant smoke and poor air quality in overheated frame houses, combined with the stress of extreme cold and exhaustion from wood cutting, left many settlers weak and sick. Herman's structure, with its natural air exchange and stable temperature, provided a healthier environment. He slept well, ate well, and emerged from winter in better condition than most of his neighbors. When spring finally arrived in April of 1875, the settlement around Grand Island was changed. The winter had been brutal, one of the coldest on record in Nebraska territorial history. Many settlers had given up, abandoning their claims and heading back east or south to less harsh climates. But those who stayed had learned hard lessons. The most important lesson was that Hermann Weber had been right. In May, Herman helped Jacob Morrison add earth berming to his frame house. They hauled dirt and built up sloping earth banks against the north and west walls, covering the lower 4 feet of wall with compacted earth and sod. The improvement was immediate when cold weather returned the following fall. Morrison's house was noticeably warmer and required significantly less firewood. It wasn't as efficient as Herman's earth-sheltered design, but it was far better than the original construction. Before we continue with the rest of Herman's story and the lasting impact of his building methods, I want to remind you to subscribe to this channel if you are finding value in these stories. We are dedicated to recovering and sharing the practical wisdom of America's pioneers, the real techniques they used to survive and thrive in challenging conditions. These are not romantic tales, but detailed accounts of how things actually worked. Subscribe now so you do not miss upcoming episodes on forgotten frontier skills, lost building techniques, and the ingenious solutions our ancestors developed. Other settlers built new structures incorporating earth-sheltered principles. A young couple, named the Hendersons, who'd nearly frozen in their first winter, built a partial dugout for their second year. They excavated 3 feet into a south-facing slope, built up walls using the excavated dirt reinforced with sod bricks, and created a thick earth-covered roof. The structure was crude compared to Herman's refined design, but it worked. They burned half the wood they'd used the previous winter and were comfortable throughout the cold months. The summer of 1875 revealed another advantage of earth-sheltered construction that Herman had anticipated but hadn't yet demonstrated. Nebraska summers could be brutally hot, with temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity that made the heat oppressive. Frame houses with their dark tar paper exteriors and thin walls became ovens. Interior temperatures could reach 95 degrees or higher. Sleep was difficult. Work was exhausting. The heat was inescapable. Herman's structure remained cool. The thick earth covering acted as insulation against summer heat just as effectively as it had against winter cold. The Earth's stable temperature, that 50 to 55 degree baseline several feet below the surface, now worked to keep the interior cool rather than warm. Even on the hottest days, when outside temperatures reached 105 degrees, Herman's interior never exceeded 72 degrees. The difference was dramatic. On a day when Jacob Morrison's frame house interior reached 94 degrees, Herman's was 68 degrees, a 26-degree difference, but in the opposite direction from winter. The thermal mass that stored heat in winter now absorbed coolness from the earth and released it into the living space. Herman found he could enhance the cooling by opening his door and windows at night, when outside temperatures dropped, allowing cool air to flow through and be absorbed by the earth walls. In the morning, he'd close everything up, trapping the coolness inside. The structure would stay comfortable throughout the day, even as outside temperatures soared. This summer performance convinced even the skeptics. A house that stayed warm in winter and cool in summer, using minimal fuel and requiring minimal maintenance, was not a primitive dirt hole. It was a sophisticated solution to the challenges of prairie living. The The design adapted to seasonal extremes, providing comfort year-round through passive means. By 1876, earth-sheltered and earth-bermed construction was becoming more common in Hall County. Herman's influence was spreading. He'd proven that working with nature rather than against it produced superior results. His structure, built with materials available on every homestead, dirt, grass, stones, and minimal purchased lumber, outperformed houses that cost significantly more to build and maintain. The technical principles Herman applied were eventually documented by agricultural engineers from the University of Nebraska, though not until the early 1900s. They confirmed what Herman had known intuitively. Earth has a thermal conductivity of approximately 0.03 BTUs per hour per square foot per degree Fahrenheit. This low conductivity makes it an excellent insulator. A 3-foot thickness of earth provides an R value of approximately 15 to 20, comparable to modern insulation. But earth also has thermal mass, the ability to store heat. This combination of insulation and thermal storage creates a buffering effect that moderates temperature swings. The researchers also documented the energy efficiency. Herman's structure required approximately 1/3 the heating fuel of a conventional frame house of similar size. This translated to significant cost savings, reduced labor, and lower environmental impact. The thick earth covering also provided excellent sound insulation, fire resistance, and protection from extreme weather events like tornadoes, which were common on the Nebraska prairie. Herman continued living in his earth-sheltered home for 23 years. In 1882, he married a German woman named Greta, who'd emigrated from Baden. She'd heard stories about the German homesteader who'd built the warm house made of dirt. When she met Herman and saw his structure, she was impressed. She'd lived in similar earth-integrated buildings in Germany and understood the principles. They raised 4 children in that structure, expanding it twice by digging further into the hillside and adding additional rooms. The structure was expanded in 1886 with a second main room and a separated sleeping area. Herman applied the same principles he'd used originally, excavating into the hillside, reinforcing walls with sod bricks, creating a thick earth-covered roof. The expansion took him 3 months, working mostly alone, and cost approximately $35 in materials, primarily for additional lumber for roof supports and a second chimney. A comparable frame addition would have cost over $200 and required hiring help. By the 1890s, Herman's original structure and its additions had become something of a landmark. Travelers and new settlers would often visit to see the famous earth house. Herman welcomed visitors and freely shared his knowledge. He'd become an informal consultant, advising homesteaders on construction techniques, thermal design, and working with earth materials. He never charged for this advice, considering it neighborly duty to help others avoid the mistakes and suffering he'd witnessed during that first brutal winter. The children who grew up in Herman's earth-sheltered home later reported their childhood memories. The house was always comfortable, they said, never too hot or too cold. It was quiet, even during thunderstorms and blizzards. The thick walls muffled outside noise, creating a peaceful interior. The air always smelled clean, like fresh earth and grass. There was a feeling of security, of being protected and sheltered in a way that frame houses couldn't match. One of his daughters, Margareta, described it later. Other children would complain about being hot in summer or cold in winter. We never understood what they meant. Our house was always just right. When we visited friends in their wooden houses, we were shocked by how uncomfortable they were, how thin the walls felt, how you could hear every sound from outside. Our house felt solid, permanent, like it was part of the earth itself. Herman proved up his claim in 1879, gaining full ownership of his 160 acres. He farmed the land successfully, growing wheat and corn and raising cattle. The money he saved on firewood and maintenance was invested in improving his farm. He built a barn in 1881, a large structure that incorporated some earth-sheltering principles, partially dug into a hillside with earth-bermed walls. His livestock thrived in this temperature-stable environment. Jacob Morrison, who'd mocked Herman's initial construction, became one of his closest friends. The two men spent countless evenings sitting by Herman's fireplace, discussing farming, politics, and life on the frontier. Morrison never stopped feeling regret about his initial judgment. "I thought I knew better," he told Herman once. "I thought fast and cheap was smart. I learned the hard way that smart is building right the first time, even if it looks strange to ignorant fools like I was." Morrison eventually rebuilt his own house in 1891, creating a hybrid design, frame construction for the upper walls and roof, but with the entire structure partially excavated into a slope and heavily bermed with earth on three sides. The new house was dramatically more comfortable and efficient than his original building. He credited Herman with saving him years of unnecessary labor and discomfort. The agricultural depression of the 1890s hit Nebraska hard. Crop prices collapsed, drought struck in several consecutive years, and many farmers lost their land. Herman's efficient, low-maintenance structure gave him an advantage during these hard times. He had minimal cash expenses for fuel and repairs. His earth-covered roof needed virtually no maintenance, unlike shingle roofs that had to be replaced every 10 to 15 years. His walls never needed painting or siding repair. When money was scarce, these savings meant the difference between holding on to the land and losing everything. By the turn of the century, 1899, Hermann Weber was 59 years old and had become a respected elder in Hall County. The Mockery was long forgotten, replaced by recognition that he'd been ahead of his time. Several younger homesteaders built earth-sheltered structures based directly on Herman's design. One particularly successful example was built in 1900 by a Swedish immigrant named Eric Johansson. Eric spent weeks consulting with Herman, learning every detail of construction, material selection, and design principles. His finished structure was even more refined than Herman's original, incorporating improvements Herman suggested based on 25 years of living experience. The academic community eventually took notice. In 1903, a professor of agricultural engineering from the University of Nebraska visited Herman's homestead to study the structure. He took extensive measurements, photographs, and notes. His subsequent paper, published in 1904 in the Journal of Agricultural Engineering, documented the thermal performance and energy efficiency. The paper concluded that earth-sheltered construction, properly executed, provided superior comfort and efficiency compared to conventional frame construction in prairie environments. It recommended that agricultural extension services promote these techniques among homesteaders. The recommendation was largely ignored. By the early 1900s, frame construction had become the American standard. Lumber was cheap and plentiful. Construction methods were standardized. Earth-sheltered design seemed primitive, associated with poverty and the hard early days of settlement. As Nebraska communities became more established, there was a strong desire to move away from anything that looked backward or rough. Frame houses with painted siding and modern conveniences became the mark of prosperity and progress. Herman understood this cultural shift but regretted it. He saw settlers building expensive, inefficient houses that required constant maintenance and high fuel costs. He saw people struggling to heat and cool homes that fought against their environment rather than working with it. But he was a practical man, not a crusader. He lived in his earth-sheltered home, comfortable and efficient, and let his example speak for itself. In 1912, at age 74, Herman's health began to fail. He developed respiratory problems, likely from years of exposure to prairie dust and harsh conditions. He died in January of 1913, peacefully in his own bed. In the earth-sheltered home he'd built 39 years earlier, his wife Greta continued living there until 1923, when she moved to Grand Island to live with one of their daughters. The structure was sold to a young farming family who lived there until 1937. The original structure, with additions, stood for 63 years. It was finally abandoned in 1937 when the family who owned it built a new modern farmhouse nearby. The earth-sheltered home was left to weather. The wooden door rotted away. The roof eventually collapsed as the supporting logs decayed. Over decades, the structure slowly returned to the earth it had been carved from. By 1970, it was barely visible, just a depression in a hillside and some stones marking where the fireplace had stood. But the knowledge Herman demonstrated didn't disappear entirely. During the energy crisis of the 1970s, there was a resurgence of interest in earth-sheltered and passive solar design. Architects and engineers rediscovered the principles Herman had applied a century earlier. They built modern, earth-sheltered homes using contemporary materials and engineering, but the basic concepts were identical. Use Earth's thermal mass and insulating properties, minimize exposed surface area, orient for solar advantage, create thick thermal envelopes. The pioneers of 1970s earth-sheltered architecture didn't realize they were reinventing techniques that frontier homesteaders had developed through necessity and observation. Academic researchers eventually uncovered the historical precedents. Papers written in the 80s and 90s documented the earth-sheltered structures built by homesteaders in Nebraska, Kansas, and other prairie states. Hermann Weber's structure was referenced in several studies as an example of sophisticated vernacular architecture. A doctoral dissertation in 1993 by an architectural historian included extensive documentation of Hermann's design, with reconstructed plans based on descriptions from his descendants and the surveying notes from the 1903 university study. The site of Hermann's original homestead was marked with a historical plaque in 2006. The marker, placed by the Hall County Historical Society, reads Hermann Weber Homestead, 1874 to 1937. On this site stood an earth-sheltered dwelling that demonstrated principles of energy-efficient construction and thermal design. Built by German immigrant Hermann Weber, the structure outperformed conventional housing in both winter heating and summer cooling, requiring minimal fuel and maintenance. Weber's innovative approach to working with natural materials and environmental conditions anticipated modern sustainable building practices by nearly a century. His willingness to pursue proven principles despite community mockery exemplifies the independent thinking and practical wisdom that characterized successful frontier settlement. The historical significance of Herman's story extends beyond the specific structure he built. It represents a broader truth about innovation, tradition, and the courage required to challenge conventional wisdom. Herman faced a community united in their belief that his approach was wrong. Every neighbor, every passing traveler, every person who saw his construction in progress reinforced the message that he was making a mistake. The social pressure to conform, to build the way everyone else was building, was immense. But Herman had knowledge that others lacked. He'd seen earth-integrated construction in Europe. He'd experienced extreme cold and understood the challenge he'd face in Nebraska. He made calculations and decisions based on evidence and experience, not on popular opinion or social pressure. When everyone called him a fool, he had the courage to continue anyway, to trust his own judgment even in the face of universal disagreement. This intellectual independence was as important as his building skills. Many people have knowledge but lack the courage to apply it when it contradicts social norms. Herman had both knowledge and courage. The result was a structure that objectively outperformed conventional construction by every measurable standard: thermal comfort, energy efficiency, construction cost, maintenance requirements, durability, and year-round livability. The vindication he experienced was complete but quiet. There was no dramatic moment where everyone apologized. Instead, there was a gradual shift in perception, a growing recognition that perhaps the crazy German had been right all along. The ultimate vindication was practical. People adopted his methods because they worked. The ultimate validation was that his structure stood for over 60 years, while many conventional frame houses built in the same period had to be extensively repaired or replaced. The specific techniques Herman used are still applicable today. Earth-sheltered construction remains one of the most energy-efficient approaches to building in climates with extreme temperature swings. Modern earth-sheltered homes can reduce heating and cooling costs by 70 to 90% compared to conventional construction. They provide superior sound insulation, exceptional durability, protection from severe weather, and thermal comfort that expensive HVAC systems struggle to match. The barriers to earth-sheltered construction today are mostly cultural and regulatory, not technical. Building codes in many areas make it difficult to build earth-integrated structures. Zoning laws often prohibit them. Mortgage lenders are reluctant to finance unconventional designs. And there remains a cultural bias that views earth-sheltered buildings as primitive or undesirable. These barriers are maintained by conventional thinking, the same conventional thinking that mocked Hermann Weber in 1874. The lessons from Hermann's story apply to more than just building design. They apply to any situation where innovation challenges convention. The pattern repeats throughout history. An individual recognizes a better approach, faces mockery and resistance, persists based on evidence and principle, proves the approach through results, and gradually gains acceptance. This pattern describes scientific advancement, technological innovation, and social progress. Hermann Weber's neighbors weren't bad people. They were ordinary settlers doing their best with the knowledge they had. They built the way they'd been taught, following familiar patterns and accepted methods. They couldn't see beyond their assumptions. Herman could, and that made all the difference. The cabin made of dirt and leaves that neighbors mocked stayed warmer than their cabins by 47 degrees during the worst cold snap of the winter of 1874 to 1875. That's not a metaphor or an exaggeration. It's a documented, measured fact. The structure worked exactly as Herman knew it would, providing comfort and efficiency that seemed impossible to those who hadn't understood the principles. Today, visitors to Hall County, Nebraska, can visit the site where Herman's structure stood. The historical marker tells part of the story, but the real lesson is in what's no longer visible. The structure returned to the earth because it was made of earth. This impermanence is actually appropriate. Herman's legacy isn't the physical structure, which was always meant to be temporary and practical. His legacy is the knowledge that a man with understanding can build something better than conventional wisdom provides, that working with nature produces superior results than fighting against it, and that having the courage to be called a fool by fools is sometimes the price of being right. The prairie grass grows over the site now, thick and green in summer, golden in fall, buried under snow in winter. The earth that Herman carved into, lived within, and eventually returned to, continues its endless cycle. But the story persists, passed down through generations, a reminder that sometimes the person everyone mocks is the only one seeing clearly. Sometimes the strange idea is the right idea. And sometimes a cabin made of dirt and leaves is warmer, more comfortable, and smarter than anything conventional construction can provide. Hermann Weber knew what his neighbors didn't, that the earth itself is one of the best building materials available if you understand how to use it. He proved it by building a structure that outperformed theirs by every measure. He lived comfortably while they suffered. He spent his time improving his farm while they exhausted themselves cutting firewood. He created a home that lasted decades while their structures required constant repair. And he did it all while being called a fool for building with dirt. The mockery eventually stopped. The neighbors learned. Some adopted his methods. Others simply recognized they'd been wrong. But Herman had never needed their approval. He'd built for himself, using principles he knew were sound, and the results spoke louder than any argument could. That's the final lesson from this story. The truth doesn't need consensus. It just needs to be true. And if you know you're right, if you have evidence and reason on your side, then build your cabin of dirt and leaves regardless of what the neighbors say. Because when the cold comes, when the test arrives, the results will prove who was the fool and who was the wise man all along.